With the rise of the Great Resignation around the world, it's increasingly seen employers look to how they can retain and support their staff amid a growing focus on mental health. Here in the region, which is seeing the same war on talent and the global trends, the conversation in boardrooms is beginning to turn to how companies who are new to this area can effectively lead in. So today, joining me on AV Talks, I'm delighted to be joined by Paul Firth, who is the founder and managing director of ICAS MENA, which provides advice and services around employee assistance programs, EAPs, workplace wellbeing, mental health, and so much more. So Paul, delighted to have this conversation. First off, just give me a helicopter view of where you think we are. Where's the region compared to globally? It feels like the conversation's getting louder, but the volume still needs to be turned up a lot.
First of all, good morning, Scott, and thank you for this opportunity to join you today. In terms of this region compared to globally, I've been here 12 years.
Yeah.
I've seen a dramatic change in the 12 years I've been here.
Yeah.
From 12 years ago, where mental health certainly was not spoken about. It was still a taboo.
Yeah.
And today, we're here now, we're talking about mental health.
Yeah.
If we look on LinkedIn, probably nearly every other post is a post around mental health in the workplace, the impact it has on the individual, but also business. So the positive is we're now talking about it. And I think, most companies now are looking to, or recognizing that there is a challenge with mental health and they have to and need to be doing something from a workplace perspective. And then the challenge starts for them in terms of, well, what does that look like? What would it, how does that exist for us and how can we actually make that happen?
I'll dive into that a little bit more in a minute. I'm just going to, it's interesting because, we talk about this region, particularly we talk about the UAE. I mean, how beneficial do you think it is? We've just moved from the 5-day working week to a 4.5 working day week. And there were differing reasons around that. There was some, alignment with global markets and that kind of thing. However, the UAE as a government, as a national, as a national body, turned around and said, well-being matters. This is also about work-life balance. How significant is that, and how helpful is that to the conversation that at a national level in black and white, the government is saying well-being matters?
Absolutely. I mean, any support, any recognition of mental health and well-being generally that is clearly very openly supported by the government, then that's leaps and strides, in terms of making the discussion around mental health not a taboo.
Yeah.
That we can talk about it and that it isn't seen. It still has an element of stigma attached to it. Not just in this region, globally.
Yeah, totally.
It still has that stigma attached to it. But the more we can talk about it, that stigma starts to, diminish. With what certainly the UAE government is doing in terms of, driving this now in terms of opening the discussion around well-being in general, which mental health plays a key part in that, then it's, it's fantastic news, for us all, really.
So I'm a business journalist, and anyone who knows me knows I bang on about the ROI of doing the right thing. And it confuses me that the chief financial officers in companies are not massive advocates for mental health because, our happier workforce is a more productive workforce. So, but from your perspective, just, in terms of that boardroom conversation, what is the business proposition for companies who open the door on mental health? What are the benefits? Just let's spell them out.
Okay. I suppose if you're looking at it from a financial perspective, within a lot of organizations, mental health will be primarily perceived as an employee issue and a personal issue. It's about an individual's personal mental well-being. Yeah. So why would I want to get involved in that as an employer?
Yeah.
And so with any form of support services that you're looking to, or any ways that you're looking to manage an employee's mental well-being or general well-being, then you have to look at two elements to it. One is the what I would term the softer side, which is more the HR focus around, making sure people are fit, healthy, and engaged. And fit, healthy, engaged people are more productive. It's then switching that from a financial perspective and saying, this is managing mental health in the workplace is no longer a nice to have. It's not an employee well-being tick box. That's part of it. It's an absolute business need. If we look at the link between, health and safety is a primary link for the justification of mental health. If we look at what generally is behind the cause of a health and safety incident in the workplace, we're pretty much guaranteed it will be at that moment in time, whatever the incident was, that individual was not focused, was not engaged on what they were doing. And why would they not be focused and engaged? Because they will be thinking about something else. They'll be thinking, their mind will be on other challenges in their life, and their psychological well-being plays a massive part in that. So, there's a very clear link between managing effectively an individual employee's well-being. Within that is a significant focus is around mental health, and by not doing the potential impact, negative impact in the business. So whether it is, there's data now that's coming out specific for the region, which is fantastic, but there was, I'm just trying to remember, I think it was a Gallup research that was done about 2 years ago now, that was saying around anywhere between 60 to 85% of the working population in this region are disengaged at work.
Okay.
Now, that's a horrible statistic when you look at it and say, seriously, the majority of my employees, when they're at work, are disengaged. What's the impact on the business? That's horrendous. And yet that's a fact. That's happening now, but it's not something you can physically see. And so what we're really talking about generally with mental health in the workplace is what we term presenteeism. So I'm at work in body, but I'm not necessarily there fully in mind. Now, that's a harder one to identify because I'm physically there. You're in the office now. So Scott's in work and he's doing what he should be doing, and he's productive and he's achieving his job and the goals of the business.
That's a matter of debate.
But that's the automatic assumption I have to make, because that's what you're there to do. But the reality is not that, not necessarily in your case. But statistically, the reality is not that. And it's not being negative in terms of the individual. It's just saying it's human nature. And we have to then understand from a work, an employee perspective and from a financial perspective, well, I can't ignore that. So I have to look at ways I can start to reduce that level of disengagement. I have to look at how I manage that, because that level of disengagement then links into risk and liability from a health and safety perspective. And this is where then it really becomes a financial focus. And that's where we need to get to.
Man, I could literally go off in all different directions on just like 3 or 4 of the things you just said there. If we talk about, you used an interesting word there, which was manage. And there is this whole, the age-old adage, which is if you can't measure it, then you can't manage it. Is this, again, you talk about, it's almost like the hidden cost of. Is this where companies really do need to wake up to the fact that there is a hidden cost, and they have to start doing something to try and measure it, or they'll never be able to manage it?
Absolutely. If we're talking presenteeism, I often describe it as it's the iceberg. It's the hidden iceberg. So sickness absence is the iceberg we can all see on top of the water. So when you're not in work, it's clear to see. And I, as a business, I can now associate a cost to that. The bigger challenge, and there's been many years data and research, is saying that presenteeism, the cost of presenteeism is at least 3 times the cost of absence. And absence as a cost is billions for industries. But it is hard to identify, and it's the harder one to manage. We can manage it, but we've got to manage it in a completely different way. And you know, that now becomes the challenge. And you know, and that's that. If we're coming back from a business perspective in terms of cost, then why would I ignore that? It's happening now within my business, whatever industry I'm in. But I need to do more to put things in place. Yes, I do refer to manage. And before we can manage the outcome of what we do, we need to understand what that problem is and how we can go about then, you know, managing that appropriately.
I mean, you talk about the tip of the iceberg. I mean, I saw statistics, and this was back from 2019 for the UE alone, which said that the cost to productivity in terms of lost man hours through absenteeism, presenteeism, particularly mental health, that's through mental health, was $5.9 billion in the UE alone. And then we look at the global situation where you're looking at 5 trillion. So it's there, isn't it? I mean, the cost to business is undeniably there. Why are we having so much trouble actually recognizing that as an issue? Why do we not want to open the door? I always ask these multi-layered questions. I was in a conversation with a guy called Sir Ian Cheshire, who runs the global business collaboration for better mental health in the workplace. Millions of, he's got lots of companies signed up. And he basically said, companies are scared to open the door on this because they don't quite know what they're going to find when they open it up. And I know we were talking before we began this conversation about the risks and the responsibilities that companies need to consider. How can they consider that without scaring them, without putting them off? What are those things that the employees need to do? And how can we encourage them to not be scared, but actually just start down the road?
Well, I think if you, again, you know, if I use, you know, I reference that analogy of, you know, the health and safety incident, and why somebody would that incident would happen, that individual's not fully engaged in what they're doing at that moment in time. And statistically, if we step back from that and say, so what would it be that would stop that individual from being fully engaged? Then not in every case, but in majority of cases, it's issues in their personal life. And it's the day-to-day issues that we all experience: relationships, you know, health, the whole gambit. Now, as an employee, you don't really want to get involved in somebody's personal life, but you, at the same time, you have to recognize, but I can't ignore that those personal issues that are affecting that individual in the workplace now have an impact in the workplace, and I can't ignore that. So the challenge then is, well, how can you, without getting directly involved in an individual employee's personal life, manage, again, we're back to manage that situation. I want that individual to better manage their personal life in very simple terms. So you have to make a whole range of support services. You know, I mean, we talk generally in terms of the 7 pillars of well-being: your physical, your emotional, psychological, your occupational, your social, your environmental. I'm trying to think what we've got to there, 5 or 6.
6 of them you got there.
So, and we need to help an individual manage all those pillars, because any one of those pillars will be the triggers for me ultimately being not as focused or engaged or as productive in the workplace. And the one that of the pillars that really is the central focus to all that is our mental health, our psychological well-being, because all those other pillars that can become affected will affect us psychologically. And it's how we react and respond as individuals to those challenges that we experience. So then that's why we're now seeing the talk and a lot of the activity we see on social media today, most of the time now talking about mental health and the challenge of mental health. You know, the World Health Organization state that, you know, by 2030, depression will be the number one health condition. You know, so not cancers, not heart conditions. Whoa, hang on a minute. That's less than 10 years away.
Well, that's actually been up to the new Museum of the Future. They've actually got that in as the narrative because over there it's obviously focused to 50 years. I
haven't been there yet. So.
No, but literally to underline what you said there, they kind of got their, they're obviously looking 50 years into the future, looking back. And as part of the narrative, they go 2030. Loneliness and depression becomes the biggest killer of human beings. And as you say, the World Health Organization is already predicting, already modeling that it's going to be the biggest cause of mortality in the world.
I mean, if we look at WHO's statistics, today in the UAE, there's going to be around 300, nearly 400,000 people currently with depression. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I sort of as well. It's a question I was going to come on to. So you've sparked a question in my brain, which is like, okay, so the global average across the world would tend to be that 1 in 4 people will be impacted by mental health. I tend to believe that that's who presents, and actually it's 1 in 1 or 1 in 1.5 or something like that. So I'll get your thoughts on that. Here in the UAE, though, the research recently that we saw was it's actually 1 in 3. So we're actually more stressed, and that was underlined by a report that Cigna did last year. I don't know if you remember, where they were saying we're one of the most stressed.
360, absolutely.
One of the most stressed nations on the planet. I mean, are you seeing that play out in this region, and what do you think underpins that? Because obviously you're working with workplaces all the time, so you're right at the coalface on this one.
Our data supports all of that. If we look at the top 5 presenting problems when anybody engages with our EAP, we look at the top 5 presenting problems: stress, depression, and anxiety are the top 2. And they have been now for the last, I think, 3 years. And they've always been in the top 5, but now I'm not saying permanently because we don't know what will happen, but the last 3 years, they've now sat in the top 2. If we then look at what was I going to say? If we then look at the data that Cigna did, absolutely concur with that. Why? I think for me, one of the biggest factors, if we think you and I are expatriates, and we know statistically, 85% of us here, the population here is expatriate.
Yeah.
So we're a population primarily, it's not ignoring the local Emirati population, but if we talk in terms of what might be driving this, we're a population generally that is expatriates. We're away from our home country. That brings, again, there's lots of data around the impact on an individual's mental health for expatriates.
Yeah.
They do live a nice life, but there are always additional factors that challenge from a psychological perspective. If we then look at again our existence here, the relationship between employee and employer is like nowhere else.
Yes.
My whole existence here is linked to my employer.
Yeah.
Now that brings stresses in itself. So if I lose my job in the UK, I lose my job.
You still keep your access to healthcare.
I still keep everything else.
Yeah,
I'm not expected to leave the country. Yeah, my daughter's still in school, and I still have my home. As long as paying the mortgage and everything. Here, completely different.
Yeah.
And so there's that immediate pressure that's on us.
Yeah.
And I think that adds to, and I think we have to accept as well, historically here in the region, and very much in Dubai, there is this work ethic of you work long hours. The longer hours you work, the more you're achieving, the more productive you are.
Yeah.
Now that's absolute nonsense, but it's there's all the evidence to say that is not the case. It's actually not the case. But that's historically how the workplace has been here, and it's been driven like that. You mentioned at the beginning about we've the move from 5-day working week down to 4.5, or maybe even 4. There's a global push for 4. Is it good or bad? Is it workable or not? There's no reason why it can't work. The challenge is if you move from 5 to 4, what else happens to support that move? If you move from 5 to 4 and just make the working day longer, to cover your 5 days in 4, you achieve nothing. You probably make it worse.
Yeah.
So there's other things have to happen, and that comes down to the culture of work and how we work, and we have to work smarter to be more productive. And you can work smarter and be more productive with fewer work days. But it's not just the fact of moving from 5 to 4.
Matt, do you know what? I can have this conversation all day with you, Paul, and I'm not sure that the audience would say with. But you're literally so two things on that, and I completely concur with what you say about this kind of unique relationship between employee and employer. Arabian Business, we launched our resilience channel about 18 months ago. Kind of what sparked that off for me when I took over Arabian Business was Celia Afridi from the Lighthouse Arabia. She wrote just a really powerful column for us, which was about toxic workplaces, toxic bosses, and how it's actually not so easy for employees to actually stand up to their bosses. Because as you say, you have this underlying stressor that your entire existence here is linked to your employment status. So that means it's not just tell your boss to shove his job. Your daughter loses a school place, you lose your access to healthcare. You've got to.
It's your whole life.
Yeah,
it's not just a job, it's your whole life.
Yeah. So how important is it for boardrooms to recognize that actually that's a really unproductive lever for managers to pull here? Because it's an easy lever to pull, to use fear and anxiety to try and get more productivity. That's a lever that we've got to remove from the machinery. And then the second piece you were talking about there, just in general, again, going back to the productivity question, and that always on, we live in an ambitious city, don't we? It is one of those places in the world where there's a lot of opportunity. We're going to be chasing it. But if companies want to actually capture as much of that, they need to kind of figure out new ways of capturing it, rather than this old traditional. What confuses me is like we've had this way of working for 100 years. Since Ford and all that sort of thing. Why have we not evolved? Nothing else stays stagnant. No other practices that we have in any other industries stay stagnant at one level, but we continue to work the way we worked almost a century ago. It's almost like the Victorian mill ethos. So again, another multi-layered rambly question for us. Employers taking that lever out of the machinery because it's not going to be. And secondly, why aren't we evolving in terms of our workplace practices? Or are we?
Well, I think we are. I think part of my answer to your first one would be to say that I think we are seeing a change, twofold. I think one from the employer's perspective, for a lot of employers now recognizing that the stick approach, the 70s, 80s style of management. You do as I say, and the louder I shout it, the quicker you will do it. Those days are diminishing. It still does exist. But I think companies are recognizing actually that actually achieves very little. If anything, it probably works against the business, because if we step back again and say, I want that those employees engaged, committed, and productive. Now, if I'm using the stick approach, I am going to, achieve the opposite of that. The outcome might be I want that work done tomorrow and I get it done, but then it's what quality sat round what work was done. Is it the right quality? Is it achieving what the business wants? It's done, but is it achieving what we need? And I think there's enough data again in terms of making clear that approach now doesn't work. But I do see companies, changing that, and that's really the culture within the organization. The culture of the organization has to say, if you're a manager that works that way, we don't accept that. You shouldn't be working that way. You have to be more, has to be more empathy. There has to be more collaboration. You are the manager and you're there to manage the team, but you work as a collaborative team. That's how we get the best out of you as a manager in the team. I think the counter to that then is, I think what we are seeing now is a change in, again, the employee-employer relationship. I'm old enough, if I think back to an interview for a job for me was, how can I persuade you, the employer, to employ me?
Yes.
I think what we're seeing now is that changing.
That's a fascinating point. That is a really fascinating point. Particularly all the research that I've seen tends to point to, that the millennials, the Gen Zs, and the ones that comes after that, the Gen Alpha, they're rejecting, and I think we're of a similar generation, I think, Paul. But they're rejecting the model that we grew up with, and increasingly looking at that and going, I don't want that. We had Gary Vee in town recently, and he made a point which was like, if bosses are worried about the Great Resignation, which is a thing, and there is a talent, they need to be really, really worried about the great, I'll never come and work for your company in the first place.
Absolutely.
If they can't attract talent, and you can't attract fresher young talent, surely that puts companies on a path to almost an existential crisis, because they can't innovate, they can't be agile, they're not going to be open to the disruptive technologies, and they have an aging workforce that's disconnected to ever-changing, fast-paced markets.
And the outcome of that, I would have to suggest no business wants. I would even question whether you, as a business, you would be sustainable in the longer term. So you have to change. It's not a case of, I don't like that. It's not the way we've worked, and we're not going to change. You have to change, and it's the way the world is. And we spoke again earlier about, work-life balance. Again, with that scenario, it's more about a life-work balance. Yeah. And millennials today are thinking, how can I make that job fit in with the lifestyle I want? Yeah. Not how can I make my lifestyle fit around my job? The whole dynamics are changing, and it's not saying we have to be, we're being soft with employees and we're kowtowing to what they want, but they want their expectations are different. Yeah.
We have to accept at our age bracket, shall we say, that the world
has changed.
The amount of conversations I have where it's like, eyes roll, well, we were bloody miserable, so they should. We were miserable, so they should be miserable. And in fact, actually, it is. I would ask you: do you think we've reached that inflection point now? And I've made this point before, and I'd be interested to see your perspective. And we've had other speakers on stages at Arabian Business events that have said, if companies don't get on board with this, 5 to 10 years time, they will be facing genuine existential challenges. You talk Absolutely. About business sustainability. So this is, as to circle back to your point earlier in the interview, it is no longer a nice to have, it's a business imperative.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I could carry on this conversation forever, but I'm going to ask you a personal question. How do you look after yourself and avoid burnout? I mean, you should be an absolute expert at this, Paul, surely.
Try to practice what I preach. I'm not perfect in practicing what I preach. Nobody probably is. No. But, generally, as an individual, I've always been quite relaxed and quite resilient. But I think for anybody, I think it's understanding what we mean by resilience and how we can develop our skills in enhancing our ability to be more resilient to things. I think the very simple thing is being able to, as an individual, to recognize what you can and can't influence, and focus on what you can influence, and certainly when you put that in a workplace perspective, there are many things in the workplace perspective as an employee you won't influence. If the business decides to make a structural change, that's going to happen. There's nothing I can do as an employee that will change that. The impact it has on me will depend on how I respond to it and how I can deal with that. And so the resilience is a big thing for me. I still at my age, I was playing last night, play football twice a week. I like to get my golf in at the weekends. Golf for me is just, some say it's a long walk wasted, but it's. I
don't agree with Mark Twain on that one.
It's 4 hours, literally 4 hours of downtime to me, because I have to focus on my golf to achieve anything. So I don't think about anything else.
Mind you, if you see me play, I'm not sure if it's good for my mental health or not. Last question. Obviously, I give us just a little elevator pitch on some of the services that ICAS MENA, the work you've been doing in this space, because you've been here in this region for some time. And again, another one of my rambling multi-layered questions. Any companies that are tuning into this, what are some of the danger signs that a company should be looking at and going, right, we have an issue, we need to tackle it?
I think first thing is be positive and do want to tackle it. But I think some of the things you need to consider, I think for me as soon as you are bringing any mental health service delivery either into as part of the workplace interventions, as an employer, you have to be aware and be conscious of liability. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter how that comes about, whether it's you are referring or persuading people to engage with somebody like us, delivering an EAP to the company, whether you, as an employee, have a relationship with a local psychology clinic to deliver counselling support, whether you are using some of the online apps that provide maybe access to discounted counselling, whether you're using the multitude of mental health apps that are now available. Whichever route as an employer you might be steering people towards, you are now initiating liability. And you have to then understand what that means. You then have to understand, well, now we have to, I use the word manage a lot, we have to manage that liability risk. Yeah. And so, if we think of delivering counselling support, psychological counselling support, in very basic terms, generally it is patient psychologist. Yeah, that's the relationship. And the focus primarily is on me as the patient to helping me. As soon as we have initiated through workplace interventions some form of employer liability, there's now three parties involved: patient, psychologist, employer. Now, we're not talking about breaking confidentiality. That still is a requirement. But now, as a psychologist delivering that counselling support, I have to think of the broader picture and the potential liability from an employer's perspective. So if I use it as an example, maybe I'm seeing a counsellor regarding maybe some alcohol consumption abuse. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, patient psychologist, that is not if we look at the risk protocols, standard risk protocols in delivering psychology counselling, it's around harm to the individual, another person, a child, or an act of terrorism. Yeah. So me seeing you as a psychologist, then I may be suffering from some form of alcohol substance abuse. That may not be an immediate harm to me, may not be a harm to another person, may not be a harm to a child or an act of terrorism. Fine. So that counselling will continue. If we now put that same scenario in the context of workplace intervention, now the question raises, well, hang on a minute, is there any potential risk with that individual now with that alcohol consumption within the workplace? What industry sector is it? What's that individual's job? What's their role? Is it a safety sensitive role? All of a sudden now risk is heightened. So it wasn't a primary risk of harm to an individual, but there is potential now risk within the work environment. Yeah. So for argument, if I'm a pilot, then, me acknowledging, and talking about substance or alcohol consumption being an issue now becomes a risk, which wouldn't become a risk under normal standard risk protocols. So both the psychologist delivering the counselling and the employer need to now understand, be able to identify the risks, and that's the key point, and then managing that risk appropriately. So we work with over 200 companies here, and some of those we will have very specific risk protocols embedded in our processes over and above the standard risk protocols. Yeah. So we work with the oil and gas industry, the airline industry. They will have additional risk protocols that will trigger certain responses and interactions. And that's what I'm saying in terms of as soon as we are going into, as an employer, engaging with the provision of some form of mental health service support from a workplace perspective, no matter how soft I am using these services, maybe just a gentle referral, gentle as it might be, it is still now establishing a form of liability. And that's what we need to be mindful of.
And to close on this, because time is against it, If I put my CEO head on, I just heard a very, very high pitched scream in my head when I heard the word liability. With that in mind, are the rewards still far, far, far outweighing the risks of getting into this space? So we go back to the fact that you say it's no longer a nice to have. Is it something that organizations need to walk in with eyes open? But there is that, again, talking what was City in Cheshire was talking about. The minute you use the word liability, it's quite a highly charged word, and you can
And
see,
rightly so.
yeah,
And rightly so.
and you can see companies going, well, we're just not going to get it. We're just not going to open the door. However, what's the risk versus reward balance on that one in your terms? So what's the business proposition for going, yes, you're scared of liability, however, you still need to do this?
Yeah, no, very good question. I think I would, if we take that same scenario, and say we as an employer, we're concerned about opening up the door of liability, so we'll keep it closed, so we won't do anything. I'm still, as an employer now, sat with the psychologist saying, I've got this problem, please help. Well, if nothing happens, that liability might become, might happen. And if that and we don't know what that liability might be, but it could be health and safety issue, could be an incident, could be a death in the workplace, could be a whole host of things. Well, any business will know, if there is a major health and safety incident, what is the cost impact of that to the business? That's why health and safety is such a high focus in most industries, because you want to avoid it. One, for best practice, but two, the cost of it, should it happen, is beyond any of your budgets.
Are we evolving? Sorry, and I'm cutting you off. And
no, you're okay.
Yeah, no, but are we is the discussion evolving here? Because, okay, so if I look at workplace, the legislation now is that I must have a physical first aider, but we don't have mental first aiders as part of the legislation. And also, is that conversation, you imagine you have the health and safety investigation. Now, often a health and safety investigation might point to, yes, there was a physical thing that went wrong there. But are we getting to the point where health and safety investigation is going to turn around and go, well, you had no mental health policy, so therefore you are liable because you had no mental health policy, and you're employing people that are in X, Y, E, do you think we're evolving to a point where employees will have a responsibility to provide some form of mental health pastoral care, shall we say?
That's already there in the UK.
Right.
In the UK, it's part of health and safety legislation that you have to provide a duty of care around mental health. So if an event happened in the UK and an incident happened and there was clearly no mental health provision or support was provided, you've broken, the legislation. You will then suffer the consequences. Do we have that here yet? No, we don't. I think it will come. If we look again, if I go back 12 years and look at the legislation that was around then to what is around now, it's leaps and steps ahead. And the one thing we touched on earlier in terms of Dubai UAE, when it wants things to change, it can make change happen. And unlike in the UK, where it will take several months of legislation, maybe even years of legislation to get through and put it on as a legislative requirement, here it can happen tomorrow if we want it to happen tomorrow. I think it will happen. Because I think if we don't manage mental health within the workplace, I don't want to scaremonger, something will happen at some point that is very clearly linked to somebody's mental well-being. And then somebody will say, we can't allow this to happen. Now, hopefully we don't get to that point and we recognize that risk and put in the requirements to ensure that we minimize that risk. But I think we are moving towards that. Occupational health is another thing that we can see snippets of that now starting to establish itself here in the UAE, and that's, again, as an analogy, my description of mental health delivery, that is a clear analogy through occupational health. If you look at a general doctor and an occupational health doctor, a general doctor treats the patient. An occupational health doctor might treat the patient, but will also be looking at what was the cause of that illness, that injury. Yeah. And we're doing the same from a mental health perspective. Okay, it can be outside of work, but what's the potential impact of that if we don't manage it appropriately in the workplace? And we're trying to ensure that it doesn't become an issue in the workplace. So I think, yes, we are seeing that change. Is it as quick as I would like to see? No, it's not. And I think we can move quicker. And I think the companies that are recognizing the need for this and are recognizing it's a business need, not a nice to have, they're going to be steps ahead when any legislation does come in. And they will be the ones that will win from being ahead.
That feels like a mic drop moment there. And I keep saying that last question. I'm going to ask you one last question as well. I mean, you look at the UK and look at where the UK's come on that journey. One of the things I always look at on many fronts with the UAE and this region, but the UAE in particular, if you plot that line graph, even over the last 10 years since you've been here, from where you were to where we are today, to then you kind of project that into the future. As you say, this is a region where once they decide something needs to happen, it happens, and it happens quickly. So final sort of message to the employers watching this, is this coming at you whether they like it or not?
It's not coming at you, it's already there. You may not be recognizing that, but as things progress and the challenges become more apparent, you will start to see, realizing it have an impact on your business. So it's coming, it's already here. Sitting and doing nothing is not going to be an option, and I think the reality is it's not a significant cost to business to actually put things in place to manage it. An EAP, can be, it's as little as 8 dirhams per employee per month. If you look at that as that's less than 100 dirhams a year.
Nothing, is it?
Now, it's nothing in context of, an employee cost to the business. So why should we be scared about it? We shouldn't be. It's a relatively low cost to put things in place to manage it. And by managing it, we'll make significant savings in reducing risk, but actually increasing productivity. You go to any business and say, if I can increase your productivity by 0.5%, they'd snap your hands off, because that's a massive impact to business.
Yeah.
So it doesn't have to be, we can increase your productivity by 20-30%. Small margins, low cost, small margin, big win. Simple as that.
There's a mic drop moment for an Arabian business audience in particular. So yeah, chief financial officers or CEOs, chief empathy officers, obviously not chief executives.
Yeah.
If you're watching that, listen to that. Paul, thank you very much for joining us on AB.
No, thank you, Scott.
Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks.